Hi, Bronwyn Williams. We're back with the small print, and today my guest is Greg Mills. So on this show, we always ask our guests to introduce themselves the way they would like to be introduced. So Greg, please tell us who Greg is.
I'm Greg Mills. I direct the Brenthurst Foundation, which is based out of Johannesburg, which is, I guess, a think tank working in the policy space and has been so for 20 years. Before that, I was the National Director of the Institute of International Affairs based at Jan Smuts House on the Wits campus. And the Brenthurst Foundation was established in end of 2004 by the Oppenheimer family.
So you know a bit about some things. That's what you're trying to tell us. You get paid to think professionally for a living.
I guess so. I probably know lots about, a lot of things. And sorry, should I rephrase that? I know a little about a lot of things, probably not as much as I should, but I have been very fortunate to have exposure to much of the world. And really the methodology of the foundation is all about seeking to understand what best and bad practice looks like in development and seeing whether some of those lessons, some of which have been, as I intimated, bitterly learnt, can be learnt before they're experienced, or the policies can be shaped in a positive way by African countries. So most of our work is on the African continent, although we have from time to time engaged outside of it, both to learn these policy lessons, but also, very importantly, since we're an applied policy institution, to actually learn how to make policy work and give it traction in different places. So a lot of my time is spent acting as an advisor to governments elsewhere in Africa. Currently, I spend about half my time, for instance, in Zambia.
And how receptive are those governments or / clients to the thoughts that you've been thinking?
Well, that's something that's covered in this book, Expensive Poverty, to an extent. And there's certainly been some lessons learned by us in this regard. I'm sure there's been some lessons learned by the countries involved too. But our methodology has always been that the governments have to invite us in. So the head of government could be a prime minister, president, even a head of state like a king could invite us in. And so that really sets the terms of engagement. We get past the first hurdle, as it were, of unrequited advice being being slopped out at governments and expecting that somehow to sort of graft onto the machinery of state. So we're inside the beast most of the time. It doesn't necessarily mean that things happen. I would say that the metrics of success are really about, obviously, seeing whether you can get things to change in a positive direction. I suppose the metrics of success are fundamentally about growth and prosperity and stability. And I think that probably about half the time we are successful, but we've got, I like to believe, slightly better at our job over time. So we've learned what doesn't work. I mean, one of the things I talk about in the book is if you have to write a paper, you've probably failed because that paper's frankly got no chance of being read. And even if it is, it's probably by somebody who has plenty of time on their hands, and it's probably not in the highly pressurized government environment that I'm at least familiar with. So, you've really got to identify the problems, identify the solutions, and then the crucial bit that I've certainly experienced is getting from one to the other, actually planning your way towards solutions. And international experiences come in handy in understanding both the diagnosis and the solution, but they also come in handy in terms of getting the right people around you to manage that, affect that process of change.
That's all fascinating, but let's get into some specifics because you've been talking very, very broadly about what you do in theory. So let's talk about in practice. What are the things that you are thinking about at the moment, both professionally at the foundation and personally? And if you want to use this opportunity to shamelessly plug your latest book, which is called Expensive Poverty, please go ahead and be my guest, very literally. Excuse me, I can't help myself with the puns.
Yeah, I mean, the things we've been working on, of course, is to try and refine our engagement with countries. But of course, the foundation's work is not exclusively on, country-specific projects or sectoral-specific projects within countries. It's actually also about playing a role as a public policy institution. So I've just spent some time in Ukraine. I was there last week, and our role as a foundation is really to drive policy change, but also to educate people, to make people aware of the consequences and of the options. And to do that, we have a very simple rule, which is don't write about stuff that you haven't had personal experience of, which means that if you want to write about contemporary developments, you're going to have to find yourself from time to time in difficult places. A lot of researchers prefer the comfort of being behind their laptop. I, for one, am not one of those. I prefer being out there interviewing people on the ground, seeing things for myself. There's the old adage that your eyes never lie, and I think that if you use them wisely and find yourself in the right place and keep an eye and an ear open, you can learn a great deal. So Ukraine is obviously very high up on our list of things at the moment. I'm deeply concerned about the impact of Ukraine, plus other developments on Africa. There's almost a perfect storm out there at the moment, a combination of high rates of demographic growth, so large numbers of people, particularly in African cities, plus increasing costs of borrowing. And that's in part because of the 12 years or more of large volumes of sort of helicopter money, both from the global financial crisis and now from COVID. And that's slowly cranking up interest rates internationally, and of course, led by the Fed in the US. And that's going to lead to higher costs of borrowing for small markets and very unrealistic returns for those small markets to deliver on to be able to borrow that money. And that's particularly problematic for high-risk markets and small markets in Africa. And then, of course, food security. And food security is sort of compounded by two aspects. One is climate change, particularly in the Sahel region. And that feeds into sort of a political disquiet across the region, which is already there, and they're already having those problems beforehand. But now, particularly with Ukraine. So, I think it's estimated that 1 in every 3 loaves of bread in West Africa, in North Africa, and in the Horn of Africa is made with Ukrainian wheat. So the costs of the constrictions on Ukrainian production, but particularly on Ukrainian exports, is going to have a big short-term effect on food security and thus political stability. These things are all tied together. So those are the sort of top few items, and obviously expensive poverty and the promotion of the ideas in that. And I've just finished editing another book with some colleagues called Better Choices for South Africa, and that'll be coming out next month. And then in between all of this, I, as a result of 4 deployments in Afghanistan, and then a particularly large amount of time spent there last year in trying to cobble together a last-minute peace process in the region, working for President Ghani, led me to write a book with a colleague called The Ledger, which was really an accounting, hence the title, The Ledger, for failure in Afghanistan. And that's just appeared, and we're doing the rounds with that as well. So it's a busy old time, I guess. And I guess the extent of our busyness and our activities generally coincides with periods of instability and concern. And I think that's one of those right now in global politics, but also in African politics.
But isn't that really the crux of the problem? If that's what you're saying, that you get busier and people get more interested in your ideas when things break, as opposed to being interested in your ideas of how to prevent things from breaking. Do you find that your work tends to be quite reactive, and that's where people are more receptive to what you're doing? Or do you think you've had any success in preempting or avoiding some of the issues that we can see playing out? I mean, you don't have to be have a crystal ball to understand cause and effect, which is what basically most economists and most think tanks are trying to figure out. If you do this, this is likely to happen at its very, very basic level. But instead, we seem to be in a point where this has happened. Now help us fix it. But you can't unscramble that egg.
Yeah, I mean, I sometimes think it'll be nice to work on a region where things were generally moving upwards at a higher rate, or higher rate of ascent at least, than there have been in Africa. But I suppose if things were moving along swimmingly, they wouldn't really need us, or they would need us for different reasons. So we would adjust and do different stuff. I mean, I do think it is in part reactive and crisis driven, undoubtedly, and that creates more desperation and more desire for quick solutions, which are not always the best way forward. But I do think that as we have changed as an institution and have learned lessons, we've got better at working with partners and more discreet, actually, in terms of who we select as our partners. So it's not just what I call the stomping out fires mode, and that we can actually put things in place strategically for a longer term process of growth and stabilization. So I think one of the big things I've learned, Bronwyn, is that a lot of this is relationship dependent, and that's probably not very good news to young people who want to go and change the world tomorrow at the start of their careers. But at the start of my career, I had a PhD at the age of 27, and I thought I could change the world immediately and do everything that I wanted to do. And actually, it's a slightly bitter but nonetheless rewarding lesson to learn that relationships take time, and you need to work at them, and you need to hear people's stories out, and you need to understand where they're coming from, and you need to understand why African economies, for instance, go through these cycles of growth and overspending and collapse and bring in the reformers and then go through another period of growth, and why you can't have a more stable and less cyclical nature to it is a big challenge for all of us. So, but I think the benefit of experience and the little bit of wisdom, in my case, that goes with it, a small fraction of wisdom, that helps you get some perspective, but it really helps you on the relationship side. And I think the relationships where we have worked best as an institution have been those that have actually been founded when those political figures weren't in power. They were actually, common or garden officials or business people, whatever, and happened to become friends with them. And later, we're doing the business of policy development with them. And Jonathan Oppenheimer has this, I think, very good expression, which is in the rest of the world, you do business and become friends. And in Africa, you become friends and do business. And that's business in the broadest sense of the term. It's not just commercial business. It's the business of getting things done and making things happen in a positive way. And I do think that for me is the biggest lesson of all is put yourself in places that you do make those relationships and collaborations work. And that's not easy sometimes. And that means getting out there. It means establishing your credibility. And I think if I had one lesson for people following behind me, it's spend a lot of time in the field when you can and develop that set of relationships, because that's your money in the bank for the rest of your life.
Yeah, get your feet dirty and connect with people. I mean, this is not advice that comes naturally to me, who tends to be a complete lone wolf. And if it would be great if everyone could just either leave you alone or just listen to you, right? But that's not the way the world works, for better or for worse. We're all stuck here on spaceship Earth with everyone else. And you have to kind of work with them. That's the whole game of being part of society, particularly when you start to look at the sort of political and economic levels where you coordinate in games between many different people. I think that point came through quite strongly in your latest book, Expensive Poverty, the one that has actually been completed, not the one you're working on next, which we can hopefully get to in a minute or two. That whole concept of having to actually build the relationships in order to not allow advice or aid, so whether that investment is in kind or in capital, to not go to waste. So maybe we should pick up on some of the ideas in that book there, which really speaks to the problem of aid and charity, something that I'm hugely skeptical of. I think that sort of, the manufactured kindness or manufactured kind of, trying to solve problems at a very cynical level, it's a huge amount of hubris to think that our capital, that we can make a better choice with capital to fix other people's problems than what people can do themselves. And whether we're talking about massive aid at a geopolitical level from one country to another, which can obviously be used and abused to dictate the future or to nudge things in a way that suits the benefactor, perhaps more than the beneficiary, or whether you're looking at it at the corporate level in terms of corporate social investment, which is something, again, I'm hugely skeptical of, because there's a huge amount of hubris in thinking that a CEO knows how to solve society's problems better than even a government would. And I say that as someone who's terribly cynical about government. I'm just cynical about everyone. I'm a terrible person. But I understand that everyone's got their own incentives. And if you are deploying charity at a geopolitical international level, you're doing it with an agenda. Your loyalty as a country is to your own people first, not to everybody else's. And if you're doing it as a company, again, your loyalty is to yourself and to your shareholders more than it really is to the rest of the world. And I think there's a lot of perverse incentives in understanding charity as being something that's necessarily good rather than something that can actually be deployed as quite an amoral weapon, whether we're talking, again, very large scale aid or quite small scale aid, but even down to the micro level. I mean, one of the latest books that I just read is Robin Hanson's Elephant in the Brain, which talks about basically how so many of our motives that we like to sugarcoat, even for ourselves, are actually quite self-interested when we get into it. We have a superficial reason. We want to give to charity because we want to make the world better, want to give to people. But really, there's a sort of underlying ego issue there too. It makes us feel good to give, right? And it makes us feel good to give conspicuously, to give in ways that we get some sort of credits for it in exchange, which does make the whole thing, again, it's when you start to unpack it like that, you can get quite depressed about human nature. But at the same time, if you understand those incentives, you can kind of work with them and say, if people do act in this way, how can we work with human nature rather than against it? Let's not deny that these things are happening, but rather switch it around. Of course, your book, now that I've had my little sermon/rant going on there, is speaking more about sort of international aid and what's gone wrong with the African continent in particular. But I think that some of those issues that I've raised do come through in your book about how a lot of that aid has been deployed for political ends and also perhaps for aesthetic ends rather than for sort of practical, the best instrumental way of doing things. So I would like to give the floor back to you to tell me where I'm entirely wrong, because I obviously can't be speaking for you, and to then clarify your position on what you think the core issue is, because the book is about the problems with the way that aid is currently deployed. What do you think the real big issue is, and why is it not making things better for Africa, even though we're giving more to it? And it is an African question in particular in the book. What's gone wrong? Let's start with the problem, and then maybe we can get into some of the solutions there too.
Great questions in the rant. Let me just give you an example, and then I'll get to answer your question about where I think the fundamental problem lies. And that is that although I think aid originally, go back to President Truman back in the 1940s, where the whole concept of foreign aid sprung from, was founded in very positive and albeit self-interested sentiment about development and developing together as a way of ensuring that there was no poverty in the world. And that came out of a sentiment, of course, it sprung from the most calamitous period of violence that the world had experienced in the Second World War. And it was, I think, a very human reaction to trying to prevent warfare on that scale and ensuring that there was enough to go around. And there was this freedom from all these various wants, as it was described then. I think over time, aid has, however, become much more about the giver than to those that it's been given to. And I'll give you an example in this regard. So when I was in Afghanistan the last time, in July last year, I became friendly with, over the course of 2 separate assignments there in 2021, with the president's personal private secretary. And we established a connection because I did what everyone should do, which is to ask him about himself. And it turned out that we went to the same university in the UK, albeit several decades apart. And we immediately established a connection. And on the 15th of August, when and we remained in contact over the period, and even when I left there in the last couple of weeks, as things became more and more difficult, we kept in regular contact. And on the 15th of August, he WhatsApped me to say that his president had just left in a helicopter, and he was left behind on the hard stand in the ARG, which is the presidential complex in Kabul, holding the president's clothes in 2 bags. And he was left behind. And he didn't know what to do, but that he was certain that he would be okay. And what followed from there was, without going too much into the details of it, what followed from there was myself and a colleague, David Kilcullen, we managed to get him and his family of nearly 20 people out. And it was a complicated story as how we learned to get them out. It was really the challenge was getting them into the airport. It was second big challenge was actually getting them to the airport. It was easier once they were in the airport to get them processed and moved to a new destination and life elsewhere. And given that he was a senior member of the government, there was obviously a great concern, a physical concern for his security. And that then gave us some learnings about how to move people out. And at the end of the day, working as a team, we were able to get nearly 1,700 people out of Afghanistan in 2 weeks. And it's a story which stands by itself, and one day we'll write it all up, I guess. But it was for me a very human story, and it was really about, I was at that point on holiday in Cape Town with my family. Dave was in Colorado with his family, and we were working on WhatsApp and Google Live, and we were moving people around Kabul to enable them to get out of the airport. But while all of this was going on, we were more or less a non-public series of actors. A lot of people were doing this public outpouring about moving folk out of Afghanistan. A lot of it was driven by very noble concerns, but a lot of it was driven by where they saw themselves in the Afghan struggle and how they felt about what had happened in Afghanistan. Perhaps this reached its low point with the movement of all the animals out of Afghanistan. And you might recall those sort of rather, tragic scenes of animals sort of being left behind, and you're seeing this now in Ukraine. But what struck me was about the self-referentialism of all of this. It was not about the animals. It was not even about, in many instances, the Afghans. It was about the people who were helping the Afghans. It was about the people who wanted to get the dogs out and cats out. It was about their feelings and sentiments and about their constituencies, not about the very people that they were trying to assist. And I think if one thing has gone wrong in aid, it is about how self-referential it is. It is about what we are doing to help others rather than what the impact is on the others of what we are trying to do. And I think that is one of the reasons overall why aid has gone so badly wrong, is you've had this extraordinary volume of aid spent in Africa, over $1 trillion over the past 30 years. So that's just in the post-Cold War period. So relatively untainted non-ideological aid by comparison to what preceded it. And yet the development results have been pretty poor, and in some cases actually negative. And you see this in the relative rates of growth of African economies compared to what the rest of the world is doing. So we continue to fall behind despite this volume of aid, maybe because of this volume of aid, in terms of our relative station in GDP per capita terms. So how wealthy Africans are in average as a percentage of global wealth, and we are and have consistently since independence slipped behind, and we are about half of as wealthy as we were in the 1960s in relative terms to the rest of the world. And so aid has not either been enough or it has not helped us sufficiently as a construct to be able to get out of these circumstances. Now then the question is why? And I would argue that in part it's because it's been given to people who lived in conditions of failure. And so it was given to them because they lived in conditions of failure. So in fact, it was reinforcing those conditions of failure rather than reinforcing conditions of success. And we shouldn't thus be surprised that they're going to waste that money, because those are the circumstances into which it's been inserted. I think the second aspect is that aid presumes that there's a single reason for the failure in many cases, which is related to financing.
Money, yeah.
And money. And yes, money is important, but it's not the only thing that makes the world go round.
Right?
And
money accelerates.
there's no magic elixir in this regard. Development is a complex business. It involves many aspects. It involves institutions. It involves state structures. It involves people. It involves knowledge. It involves capabilities, skills, education. It involves many, many moving parts. It's not just about money. So particularly those genius economists who said, we have to double aid and end global poverty. I think Britney Spears was among them, may have been Bono too. But, all those who said basically double up, double down to end global poverty. Well, that is a presumption that the capacity is going to come from more aid expenditure. And that almost externalizes the problem rather than internalizes the problem. And that for me is the third big aspect, which is this is really about how Africans organically respond to dealing with issues of underdevelopment rather than how outsiders respond to it. And the debates have been led thus in terms of this transfer of wealth by outsiders rather than by insiders in this context. And so what is this is often done is this is reinforced exclusive government practices rather than the inclusive nature of which in every instance shows that that's a much better way to go about building economies and building creating high rates of development. So anything that suggests that there's a single answer is wrong. Anything that suggests that the answer should come from outside should be disregarded or taken with a healthy dose of skepticism. And anything that suggests that the problem is just simply technical, in other words, you just got to fix the infrastructure and you just got to fix the hardware, you've got to provide more hardware, or you've got to have the right experts in at various levels to make stuff happen, is also just wrong. It involves many moving pieces, and the problem is profoundly political, not technical. So I would say that you need a strategic playbook if you're going to apply aid. It's about any plan requires the application of resources and time and people, and you've got to work on that basis. And of course, you need leadership, you need software, you need people skills, you need operating systems, not just hardware. A nice railway is nice, but who's going to run it and what's going to connect at either end is crucial in this. Local ownership is absolutely essential. So anything that says the solution is going to come from outside in the form of, again, should be dealt with a degree of skepticism. And fundamentally, you need to have accountable government in all of this. The government that is accountable not at international summits, where they love to be semi-accountable, and they love to play these summits off against each other, China versus Russia, Africa versus US Africa versus EU Africa summits. I mean, they go on endlessly. And in fact, the value of any process, I would argue, is sort of inversely proportional to the number of summits that are attached to it. They need to be locally owned through processes of governance. And the best way to do this is through accountable representative government. And this explains why over time, the majority of Africans routinely polled prefer democracy to any other sort of government. Now, we don't know the true extent to that because in some cases it's very hard to find out what Africans want because the governments don't allow these sorts of polls to take place precisely because they're not democratic. So the figure may be considerably higher. And the reason why they prefer democracy is because the alternative is so bloody awful. It's even worse than all the frailties that democratic systems routinely experience. So then donors have to operate from the standpoint, and this is one of the central arguments made in the book, Expensive Poverty, that you need to strengthen processes of accountability. And how should donors do that? Because when you've got a government-to-government system of lending in aid or giving aid, you tend to reinforce elite practices rather than reinforce organic governance. So then how do you do this? Well, I think the one way in which donors can do that is by giving more money to those countries which are more democratic. And one of the things the book does is outline a system whereby this can be achieved, a much more careful calibration between democratic standards and external aid giving, which actually reinforces democratic governance, because the more democratic you are, then the more money you get, the more opportunities you get. And they trade opportunities rather than straight cash opportunities. Sorry, say again.
Subsidize what you want more of, not what you want less of.
Exactly. And this thinking really came home to me again in Afghanistan, when I had a big argument one afternoon with an American colonel in Bagram Air Force Base who wanted to spend a large amount of money, and I was the commander's advisor, and he wanted to spend a large amount of money on a very restive area where there was very little in the way of economic activity aside from poppy growing. And I said to him, out of frustration, would you plant a tree on Mars? And he looked at me as if I'd, drunk too much Gatorade or whatever they were serving. And he said, no, eventually, of course not. So I said, well, then why do you constantly go about reinforcing failure? Why don't you reinforce success in the places that it happens? And I think one of the big problems, to sort of wrap this up, is that aid, deliberately goes about trying to remedy failure rather than trying to reinforce success. So we should be doubling down as the international community, I say we, broadly defined, on those areas which are successful. And those areas which require humanitarian assistance and peacekeeping, well, we provide that. But we don't make them the central focus. We make economic diversification and the building of institutions in those countries that are already on that trajectory the absolute key imperative in aid, because that is in our interest. It's in our interest to have success stories across Africa, and it's in our interest to reinforce those governance practices, because that's ultimately going to deliver diversification and development and jobs for this looming army of young people that we have in African environments. So it's a big question as to what has to happen and how aid agencies have to change. I mean, there's other answers, they have to appoint people into those places that really, at least if they don't like business, understand business. And most aid donors don't really like business because they come from another ideological point on the spectrum. They also like to see aid as a power relationship. It's about the power that you have over the person that you give it to. And that, of course, distorts its effect. And perhaps the most important aspect of all for governments receiving it, and this is of importance to donors as well, giving it, is that development is a Zen process. It's if you want to be free, what you have to do is let go. And in development is about governments letting go and allowing, to use the Chinese expression, 1,000 flowers to bloom by letting go. But governments, of course, don't like to let go. They like to maintain control. They want to ensure that the electorate think that they're the only reason for their survival. And what donors have to do is try and prise their hands off those levers so that African economies can actually realize the enormous potential that they have.
Wasn't that 1,000 flowers bloom actually a trap, though? That was basically a comment to let everyone speak up so you could figure out which ones to shoot down again? Just suggesting.
The sort of tall poppy syndrome, or the don't be the last person to, don't be the first person to, I think the other version of that is don't be the first person to stop clapping at a Stalin speech.
Yes, or even if he's not there. I mean, the anecdotes are amazing for those sorts of regimes. But anyway, I thought that was just an interesting interlude. But I think that the one of the big points over there is that money, like technology, doesn't solve things in and of itself. It can make bad situations worse, faster, and at a greater scale. Just like if you have an inefficient process and you automate it, you're just going to be automating away losses and inefficiencies on a technological basis. if you're adding more money to a situation that's failing, you're just going to be losing money faster, right? Because now you've got extra velocity in the system and you can make those same problems, make those same mistakes, but make them bigger and grander. And I think that this is a critical thing to understand for Africa in particular, because it's something that I've been concerned about for quite a long time. I mean, we do lots of work in the futures and foresight space. And of course, if your sort of perspective smacks of cynicism at all, and it should, because it's a moral duty to be optimistic, because expectations do shape reality when it comes to what's going to happen ahead of us, whether it's in terms of inflation or investing in democracy or whatever the case is, we do have a duty to be optimistic. But in order to be optimistic, we also have to be actually pragmatic about what's currently going on in the world. I think that one of the things that disturbs me most is you've got those great thinkers like Hans Rosling with factfulness, and Steven Pinker is, of course, another one of them, that have shown that in general, human trajectory is sort of up and to the right. I mean, like overall, things are getting better for more people all the time. Overall, in the great lottery of life, you'd be completely insane to pick a birth year not knowing where you're going to land in terms of space. That is not the year we're in right now. I mean, so that's your best chance on aggregate. But those on aggregate optimism stories hide a little bit of a dirty secret in that in reality, people are not aggregates. In reality, people are individuals. And in reality, even in those wonderful factfulness charts that all show up and to the right, poverty is just decreasing. It's not decreasing everywhere. In fact, if you kind of zoom in on SADC, so the Southern African region, quite a lot of those very basic metrics, the ones you can't really hide away from, things like life expectancy and female literacy rates, things that are quite tangible to measure, not the sort of basket numbers that we can fudge and fluff like CPI and GDP to make ourselves feel better about ourselves going forward. On the very basic levels, the improvements have slowed down and in some places entirely reversed. In the African context in particular, even as things for the rest of the world on aggregate, yay, are getting better for everyone. And that's why we have to be very careful as optimists and trying to be optimistic about the future, that we are actually seeing what the real problems are and what does need our attention, that we're not becoming sort of Pollyannas and looking at the overall, the average, hiding the real poverty and the real pain in the corners where people are simply not looking that much. And I think that the aid story is a part of that story, because Africa is, into all intents and purposes, the future continent. That's where the only continent that's actually really growing in terms of population rates by the mid-century, let alone by the end of the century. And if that's the place where those up and to the right trends have broken or in the process of breaking, we've got a very, very big problem here on Spaceship Earth. And it's not just an African problem at all. And the aid question taps into that too, because Africa has also been the general beneficiary of most of the global aid on that same period I'm talking about, when the nice, happy, cheerful curves started bending over. And you did allude when you were speaking, you did make the comment that in some cases, aid has actually made things worse and not better. And in fact, there's quite a few case studies in your book about African leaders who have stepped up and said they don't want to take aid going forward. And we think, like, why wouldn't you want to take aid? It's free money. It's not like taking on debt from like a China or taking on like a loan from a capitalistic American company that's going to come and colonize your country. What's wrong with taking aid? Why is it making it worse? Not just why is it not being deployed in the best way possible, but why and where do these things actually cause more problems and trap people into cycles that are going to be detrimental for their nations?
Yeah, great questions. You've obviously had too much coffee this morning.
I'm crazy. Read too much. He says the problem. You mustn't let women read books to get ideas.
I'll remember that in my household. Just on the 2 points you raise about the fact that the sort of up and to the right thesis is not applying to Africa. I mean, even if there's an up and to the right thesis, which to an extent there is in certain parts of Africa, and you must remember that's a collection of 55 heterogeneous countries, some big, some small, some landlocked, some double landlocked, some with commodity endowments, some not, some climate challenged or stressed, some with abundant agricultural reserves and so on and so forth. It's a very potpourri composition of states. And if we can make generalizations about them, I think that overall, the picture of aid not really making a substantive strategic difference in the case of most countries is true, with one or two exceptions. But the other big, I think, overall picture you can tell is in most countries that there's a need to end business as usual in developmental terms. And what's driving an end to this business as usual is this sort of twin nature of demography. On the one hand, large numbers of people being born into the current system over the next generation, and that's unlikely to change, at least for the next generation, because the parents of the 2.5 billionth African have probably already been born. And this demography taking place as it is in an African urban context, which is going to go to majority urban in the next decade, and then increase from that point onwards, offers both opportunity, economies of scale and development, rolling out infrastructure and providing services, for instance, but also great potential stresses if not properly planned for and catered for. Those two factors together indicate the need for an end to business as usual. So whatever we're looking at today in terms of a sort of failing developmental outcome in growth terms, and in developmental terms, including education, healthcare, equality of access, and so on, that's going to be compounded as this demography settles. And we're going to have whatever challenges we have today, they're going to be a factor thereof in 20, 30 years' time. So that, I think, should be driving a rethink on African strategies, both within and without the continent, that we can't simply keep on tinkering. We actually have to think of a new way of doing things. And these attempts to simply sort of repackage old approaches, we need to double up on money, we need less debt, we need more of another African Marshall Plan, et cetera, actually have delivered this outcome that we are aware of today. So how do we deliver something else? On your point about Africa not, about there being an increase in poverty, in many cases, yes. We don't, these aggregate statistics hide all sorts of terrible evils. I mean, look next door in Mozambique, where poverty has remained static and now is starting to climb again, where half the country is living in conditions of poverty. Look at our own country in South Africa, where effective unemployment rates, and those who are not looking for work and those who stopped looking for work, is roughly half the country, and disproportionately young members of the country. And that is going to be compounded by deteriorating services at the subnational level, of which there's plenty of evidence of in terms of municipal serviceabilities, let alone at the national level. Only look at the plight of Eskom. So all of these sort of environmental factors together would indicate that the trajectory is certainly not upwards. It would take a celebrationist to believe that the trajectory is upwards. And what are we going to do about that half of humanity at today's numbers, but potentially even greater going forward, who are marginalized, excluded from the system, which are disproportionately people in the rural areas? That may change with urbanization, but who are also disproportionately women because of religious reasons, gender exclusion, all sorts of aspects related to that. And what we do know from development is if you exclude half your population from full participation, the results follow. So, there's a whatever your prejudices and chauvinism and misogynism, you should see this in terms of developmental outcomes at the very least. So together, all of that does not paint a pretty picture, and does and should be driving change. And then, of course, on top of all of this, as a cherry on top, is you have events like Ukraine, which of course lead to a diversion away from from Africa. You know, the Ukrainian aid figure, I think approved by the US Congress last month, was close to 15 billion US dollars. That money is going to have to come from somewhere. It may not immediately come out of Africa, but may over time see a lack of increase in the African tranche in terms of preferences, or a change in the composition of those preferences. And more money will go into Europe as a consequence of this, because defense expenditures are inevitably going to increase for the foreseeable future as a consequence of Russian actions. So that's going to have an impact. So where are these, extra billion Africans going to be accommodated in the economy? And where are they going to be accommodated if they're not accommodated in an African economy? Should be seizing the minds of policymakers everywhere, and especially in Europe. Now, Europe, which gets about 2 million migrants a year, just over 2 million migrants a year, of which about 500,000 are from Africa, is suddenly, potentially going to face multiples of this number, and they're already stressed over their abilities to manage in nationalist terms, given xenophobia and everything else that goes with it, and given their own economic difficulties, to manage the figures that they're dealing with currently. So clearly something has to change, and preferably has to change in Africa, to be able to accommodate the numbers that we're talking about. And this is where I do see the continent as having enormous untapped opportunity, if only it simply did what it said it was going to do, and what governments have already committed themselves to doing. Things like open skies, things like, providing equal access in education systems, things like regional integration. Stopping regional trade seems to be a national habit, not expediting it, and so on and so forth. And then, really making it easy for people to invest in your countries, which is really making it easy for people to take money out of your countries. The two are, two sides of the same coin. These are all, basic things which we take for granted in terms of making investment decisions. We wouldn't put money into a bank that we couldn't take money out of. So why would you put money into a country that you can't take it out of, or that the rules might change and that that they might change? So changing that environment is a key part of what this book is about, and convincing policymakers and those that shape the policy domain is absolutely crucial. And there's a very good reason why African democracies have increased, have had a higher rate of growth historically in Africa compared to other systems of government. So Freedom House classifies systems of government in 3 categories: free, unfree, and partly free. Now there's only 8 unfree countries now in Africa. There used to be many more than that in that recent times, with coup d'etats and increasing fiddling of democratic elections. The number's gone down to 8, but nonetheless, over the last 30 years, if looked at in a longer sweep of history, African democracies have grown faster and in less volatile fashion, less vulnerable to international market developments, because they are diversified to a greater extent than others, than the other 2 categories. And so what donors should be doing is trying to reinforce democratic practices. And what we have seen donors often do, however, is take a very strategic view about aid, which is not strategic in the positive sense, but strategic in the negative sense. And the reason why the song that goes with this book, because I wrote a song with Robin Auld and performed it with Bobby Wine, the reason why the book was in a sense called Expensive Poverty, and that the song that goes with the book is called Don't Pay Our Oppressor, is because of a line that Bobby had when he was asked about US aid to Uganda, the country where he has been a victim of political oppression for a long period of time. And he was asked about what the US government should do, and he just simply said, well, you don't have to do anything, but just don't fund our oppressor. And one of the things that donors do is, while they give money in their very narrow interests, for a short time frame in a particular area of focus, which in this instance is Uganda's actions in Somalia as part of AMISOM, and they fund them in spite of their democratic or absence of democratic practices back home again. So one of the ways in which the outside world can help Africans to, in a sense, take charge of their own economic circumstances is by not funding their oppressor and supporting those organic systems of governance and responsibility and growth. Because one of the real negative effects of aid is that it distorts this link of accountability between African populations and those that govern them in favor of the link of accountability between donors and governments, which is not obviously correct. You need the accountability to be at home, not outside.
Yeah, that's exactly it. You can't be funding things that you don't want more of, and we have to think more carefully about where this is landing and what's going to be incentivized by where we deploy this capital. I suggest that we probably also need to be asking some of these same questions around how we are thinking about deploying things like universal basic incomes at the moment, because at a large extent, they echo the same challenges we've discussed today, but on a more micro scale rather than on a more macro scale. Money alone can't fix problems that are not based on money alone. And there's many more connected systems we need to think through, and a few more of those degrees of impact as things go forward. But Greg, thank you so much for being so generous with your time. Do go and have a look at the book, Expensive Poverty. And while you're at it, look up the Terry Pratchett Boots Index that has just been put out in the UK, because I think that's also vaguely related to this conversation, again, on more of an individual, personalized basis. But to close off with, Greg, where can people find you? Where can they buy your book? And thanks again so much for joining us today.
They can buy it at Exclusive Books and all the other reputable bookstores, some public, some private, of course. And then they can go on to the Brenthurst Foundation website, which is www.thebrenthursfoundation.org, where we publish a lot of material, some of which is in the Maverick, some of it elsewhere, and do videos and stuff. We like to think that we're reasonably adept at social media. And we will certainly put this video up on there if we're allowed to. And we see ourselves as a public resource. So if people are interested in contacting us, they can do via the website. And just like to thank you for the opportunity. It's always good to have your brain tested in spite of a 19.5-hour aeroplane flight yesterday. I've now bounced back into it because of all these probing questions. So thank you.
Thank you so much. And yeah, I don't think I was too challenging. I thought it was quite nice today. So you're great. And you clearly know a lot more than even what you've put into the book. So definitely go follow along with what Greg's doing and what the foundation is putting out. And we look forward to your next book. And maybe we can have one of these conversations when the next ideas have crystallized and been birthed and gone through that whole process once again. Thanks so much.
The next one's on African security. So I look forward to that.
Oh, that's exciting, especially in light of our recent insurrection and all the rest of it. Got to keep an eye on that. Thank you so much, Greg.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and rate us on all your preferred podcast platforms. If you'd like to find out more about what we're doing, please join our Substack community via the link in the comments below. And as always, we'd love to hear your suggestions for future guests and conversation topics.